In the unforgiving world of military discipline, where respect is earned through blood, sweat, and unwavering dedication, some lessons come at a price higher than anyone expects to pay. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez had clawed her way up through the ranks in a male-dominated world, earning every stripe on her sleeve through sheer determination and an iron will that could bend steel. She commanded respect not because regulations demanded it, but because she had proven herself worthy of it time and time again. But Corporal Jake Mitchell was about to learn that underestimating a woman in uniform, especially this woman, would become the biggest mistake of his military career. What started as what he thought was harmless banter during Chow would spiral into a confrontation that would shake the very foundations of their unit, test the limits of military justice, and prove that sometimes the most dangerous battles aren't fought on foreign soil, but right in your own backyard. Some lines should never be crossed. Some people should never be challenged. And some women should never, ever be underestimated. The mess hall at Camp Pendleton buzzed with the usual evening chatter as Marines lined up for Chow. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across tired faces, men and women who had spent another grueling day pushing their bodies to the limit under the California sun. The smell of military-grade meatloaf and instant mashed potatoes filled the air, a scent that had become as familiar as the sound of reveille. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez stood in line with her plate, her posture straight and commanding even in this casual setting. At 32, she had earned every one of the stripes on her uniform through 15 years of dedicated service. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation style, and her brown eyes held the kind of intensity that came from leading Marines through 2 deployments in Afghanistan. She wasn't the tallest person in the room, but something about her presence made others take notice. Behind her, Corporal Jake Mitchell shifted his weight from foot to foot, his blue eyes fixed on the woman ahead of him. At 24, he was relatively new to the Corps, having enlisted straight out of high school in small-town Ohio. His sandy hair was cropped short, and his face still held some of the softness that hadn't been completely carved away by military life. He had been at Camp Pendleton for 8 months now, long enough to know the routines but not long enough to understand all the unspoken rules. Rodriguez reached for a tray of corn, and Mitchell sought his opportunity to strike up what he thought would be friendly conversation. "Hey, Staff Sergeant," he said, his voice carrying just a little too much casual familiarity. "You know, I was thinking maybe you could help me out with something." Rodriguez turned slightly, one eyebrow raised. She had dealt with countless young Marines over the years, and she could usually read their intentions within the first few words. "What do you need, Corporal?" Mitchell grinned, thinking he was being charming. "Well, I've been having trouble with my laundry. You know how it is for us guys. Maybe you could show me how to get my uniforms really clean? I bet you're great at that domestic stuff." The mess hall didn't go quiet, but several Marines within earshot stopped their conversations. Rodriguez set her tray down carefully on the metal counter, her movements deliberate and controlled. She turned to face Mitchell fully, her expression unreadable. "Excuse me, Corporal?" Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that should have warned him to back down. Mitchell, oblivious to the danger he was walking into, pressed on. "You know what I mean. Women are naturally better at cleaning and organizing. It's not a bad thing. I'm just saying maybe you could help a fellow Marine out with some of that feminine touch." Private First Class Danny Chen, who had been standing nearby, took a small step backward. He had served under Rodriguez during a training exercise and had seen what happened when people underestimated her. The smart move would have been to warn Mitchell, but something about the corporal's cocky attitude made Chen decide to let this play out. Rodriguez picked up her tray again, adding a bread roll with movements that were perhaps a little too precise. "Corporal Mitchell, I want to make sure I understand you correctly. Are you asking me to do your laundry because you believe that as a woman, I'm naturally suited for domestic tasks?" Mitchell nodded enthusiastically, completely missing the ice in her tone. "Exactly. I mean, my mom always did mine back home, and my sister was always helping out around the house. It's just natural, right?" The conversation was starting to draw more attention now. Sergeant First Class Tony Williams, a mountain of a man who had been Rodriguez's friend for over a decade, paused in his meal to watch. He knew that look on Maria's face, and it usually meant someone was about to learn a very hard lesson. I see, Rodriguez said, moving toward an empty table with Mitchell following like a puppy. And, tell me, Corporal, what exactly makes you think that I would be willing to take on additional duties that have nothing to do with my job as a Marine? Mitchell sat down across from her, still grinning. Come on, Staff Sergeant. I'm not asking you to do it for free. I could pay you. Or maybe we could work out some other kind of arrangement. The words hung in the air like a live grenade. Rodriguez set down her fork very carefully, her hands flat on the table. Around them, conversations had definitely quieted now. Even the kitchen staff seemed to sense that something was happening. Corporal Mitchell, Rodriguez said, her voice dropping to just above a whisper, I need you to think very carefully about what you just said to me. But Mitchell was too far down his chosen path to recognize the warning signs. Look, I'm just being honest here. You're an attractive woman, and I'm a guy who needs help with some basic stuff. We're both adults. I'm sure we can figure something out that works for both of us. Williams put down his coffee cup with enough force to make it clink against his tray. Chin found himself leaning forward, fascinated and horrified at the same time. This was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. Rodriguez leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving Mitchell's face. So let me summarize what I'm hearing, Corporal. You approached me in the mess hall to suggest that because I'm a woman, I should handle your domestic chores. When I questioned this assumption, you offered to pay me. And, when I continued to question your logic, you implied that we might arrange some other form of compensation. Mitchell's grin faltered slightly. Something in her tone was finally getting through to him, but he was committed now. I didn't mean anything weird by it. I just thought maybe we could help each other out. Help each other out, Rodriguez repeated slowly. She looked around the mess hall, noting the faces turned their way, the conversations that had stopped. Corporal, do you see Sergeant Williams over there? Mitchell glanced over at the massive sergeant, who was now openly staring at their table with an expression that could have melted steel. Yeah, so? Have you ever asked Sergeant Williams to do your laundry? No, but that's different. How is it different? Mitchell struggled for an answer that wouldn't dig his hole deeper, but his brain seemed to have abandoned him. Well, he's a guy, and guys don't usually what, Corporal? Don't usually do domestic stuff. Rodriguez nodded slowly. I see. So in your mind, there are certain tasks that are appropriate for men and certain tasks that are appropriate for women. Is that an accurate summary of your position? The mess hall had grown noticeably quieter now. Even Marines at tables on the other side of the room were starting to tune into the conversation. Mitchell was beginning to sweat, finally realizing that he might have stepped into something bigger than he had intended. I didn't mean it like that, he said, his voice less confident than before. I just thought. You thought what, exactly? Mitchell looked around desperately, hoping someone might help him out of this situation, but every face he saw was either amused or disapproving. No help was coming. Look, Staff Sergeant, maybe I came across wrong. I was just trying to be friendly. Rodriguez stood up slowly, her 5'6" frame somehow seeming to tower over the seated corporal. Friendly. You thought it would be friendly to suggest that I should do your laundry because of my gender, and, when I didn't immediately agree, you implied that we might work out some other arrangement. That's not what I meant, Mitchell said quickly, but his protests were starting to sound hollow even to himself. Then, please, Corporal, enlighten me. What exactly did you mean? The silence stretched out between them, filled with the weight of 15 years of Rodriguez's experience dealing with men who thought they could reduce her to a stereotype. She had heard variations of this conversation more times than she cared to count, from drill sergeants who didn't think women belonged in the Corps to fellow Marines who assumed she was there to fill some kind of quota. But this was different. This wasn't happening in a private moment where she might let it slide with a sharp word and a warning. This was happening in front of junior Marines, men and women who looked to her for leadership and an example of what it meant to wear the uniform with pride. Mitchell fumbled for words, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. I thought maybe you might not mind helping out. I didn't think it was a big deal. Rodriguez sat back down, but her posture remained rigid. Let me tell you what is a big deal, Corporal. What's a big deal is when a Marine approaches a senior NCO and makes assumptions about her abilities and willingness to perform tasks based solely on her gender. What's a big deal is when that same Marine then suggests alternative forms of compensation when his initial request is questioned. I never said anything about, you said we could work out some other kind of arrangement. In what world did you think that was appropriate? Mitchell's face was turning red now, whether from embarrassment or anger, Rodriguez couldn't tell. You're making this into something it's not. I was just trying to be nice. Nice. Rodriguez tasted the word like it was something bitter. Corporal, I have been in the Marine Corps for 15 years. I have led Marines through combat operations in Afghanistan. I have earned every rank and every ribbon on this uniform through dedication, sacrifice, and excellence in my military occupation specialty. And, you think being nice means asking me to do your laundry? The mess hall was almost completely quiet now. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their clanking and bustling to listen. Mitchell looked around desperately, but there was nowhere to run. Maybe I should just go, he said, starting to stand. Sit down, Corporal. The command was quiet but absolute. Mitchell sat. Rodriguez leaned forward slightly. We're not done here. You approached me with a request based on assumptions about my gender and role as a woman. When I questioned those assumptions, you doubled down and suggested we might work out some alternative arrangement. Now you want to leave when the conversation gets uncomfortable. I didn't mean anything by it, Mitchell said again, but his voice was barely above a whisper now. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, Corporal. What you meant and what you said are two different things. And what you said was inappropriate, unprofessional, and, frankly, insulting. Mitchell stared down at his untouched tray of food, his appetite completely gone. Around them, other Marines were beginning to resume their conversations, but the tension at their table remained thick. I'm sorry, he said finally. I didn't realize. You didn't realize what? That I might take offense to being treated like a maid? That suggesting alternative arrangements might be construed as inappropriate? Or did you not realize that your actions reflect not just on you, but on the Corps as a whole? Each question landed like a physical blow. Mitchell had never been dressed down quite like this, and certainly never in such a public setting. But Rodriguez wasn't finished. Corporal, tomorrow morning you will report to my office at 0700 hours. We're going to have a longer conversation about respect, professionalism, and what it means to wear this uniform. Is that understood? Yes, Staff Sergeant. Rodriguez stood up again, picking up her tray. She had barely touched her food, but her appetite was gone anyway. Good. And, Corporal? Mitchell looked up at her with eyes that held a mixture of shame and dawning understanding. Next time you think about approaching a female Marine with requests based on your assumptions about gender roles, I suggest you think again. There are consequences for that kind of thinking in this Corps, and you just got your first taste of what those consequences look like. She walked away, leaving Mitchell sitting alone at the table while the rest of the mess hall slowly returned to normal. But the damage was done, and everyone present knew that this was far from over. Rodriguez had drawn a line in the sand, and now the question was whether Mitchell would learn from this experience or whether he would make the situation even worse. As she dumped her tray and headed for the exit, Rodriguez felt the weight of every eye in the room. Some looks were admiring, others were curious, and a few might have been disapproving. But she had learned long ago that respect wasn't given freely in the Marine Corps. It was earned through moments exactly like this one, where you stood up for yourself and the values you represented, regardless of who was watching. Tomorrow's conversation with Mitchell would be crucial. She could handle this through official channels, but she preferred to give Marines a chance to learn from their mistakes before things escalated. The question was whether Corporal Jake Mitchell was smart enough to take that chance, or whether his ego would push them both toward a confrontation that could end his career. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp California air that usually made Rodriguez appreciate being stationed at Camp Pendleton. But, as she sat in her small office at 0645, reviewing Mitchell's personnel file, she felt none of her usual morning optimism.
The young corporal's record was fairly typical for someone his age and experience level.
Average fitness scores, no major disciplinary issues, generally positive evaluations from his previous supervisors. Nothing in the file suggested he was the type to create problems, which made yesterday's incident all the more puzzling. Rodriguez had spent most of the night thinking about how to handle this situation. She could have filed a formal complaint immediately, which would have triggered an investigation and likely resulted in some form of administrative action against Mitchell. But she believed in giving Marines a chance to learn from their mistakes, especially when those mistakes seemed to stem from ignorance rather than malice.
At exactly 0700, there was a sharp knock on her door.
"Enter," she called. Corporal Mitchell stepped into the office, his uniform pressed and his bearing appropriately military. But Rodriguez could see the nervousness in his eyes, the slight tension in his shoulders that suggested he hadn't slept much either. "Corporal Mitchell reporting as ordered, Staff Sergeant," he said, coming to attention. "Have a seat, Corporal," Rodriguez gestured to the chair across from her desk. The office was small and utilitarian, with a few commendations on the wall and a photo of her unit from their last deployment. Mitchell sat down carefully, his back straight and his hands folded in his lap. Rodriguez studied him for a moment before speaking. "Corporal, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday evening, and I want to give you an opportunity to explain yourself.
But before you say anything, I want you to understand something. This is your chance to show me that you understand why what happened was inappropriate. If you use this time to make excuses or minimize what occurred, this conversation will go very differently than if you take responsibility and demonstrate that you've learned something." Mitchell swallowed hard.
"Yes, Staff Sergeant.
I understand." "Good. So tell me, Corporal, what do you think went wrong yesterday?"
Mitchell had clearly rehearsed this moment in his mind, but now that he was actually sitting across from Rodriguez, the words seemed harder to find. "Staff Sergeant, I realized that what I said was inappropriate and disrespectful. I made assumptions about you based on your gender, and that was wrong."
Rodriguez nodded slightly.
"That's a start.
Continue."
"I also realized that suggesting we could work out some other arrangement was completely inappropriate and could be interpreted as harassment."
"Could be interpreted as harassment," Rodriguez repeated. "Corporal, I'm not interested in what something could be interpreted as. I want to know if you understand what you actually did."
Mitchell shifted in his chair. This was clearly harder than he had expected.
"What I did was, I harassed you.
I made inappropriate suggestions based on gender stereotypes, and then I made it worse by implying something sexual."
"There we go," Rodriguez said. "Now we're getting somewhere. So tell me, how did you come to the conclusion that approaching me with that kind of request was acceptable?"
This was the question Mitchell had been dreading.
How could he explain that he had genuinely thought he was being friendly? That in his hometown, this kind of interaction might have been normal?
That he had never really thought about how his words might be received by a woman who had fought for every bit of respect she had earned? "I guess I wasn't thinking, Staff Sergeant. Where I come from, it's pretty normal for guys to ask women for help with domestic stuff. My mom always did mine and my dad's laundry, and my sister helped out around the house.
I thought maybe it was just natural." Rodriguez leaned back in her chair. "Natural. Let me ask you something, Corporal. When you were growing up, did your father ever do laundry?" "Not really.
He worked long hours at the factory, and my mom handled most of the house stuff."
"And your sister? Did she have chores that your brother didn't have?" Mitchell was beginning to see where this was going.
"Yeah, she did more of the cleaning and cooking. My brother and I mostly did yard work and helped Dad with car repairs."
"I see.
So you grew up in a household where tasks were divided along gender lines, and you assumed that those same divisions would apply in the military."
"I never really thought about it that way, but I guess so."
Rodriguez opened a folder on her desk and pulled out a sheet of paper. "Corporal, this is a copy of the Equal Opportunity Policy for the United States Marine Corps.
Have you read it?"
"I think we covered it in training, but I don't remember the details."
Let me refresh your memory. Rodriguez began reading from the document.
The Marine Corps is committed to providing equal opportunity for all Marines regardless of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. This includes ensuring that all Marines are evaluated and treated based on their individual merit and performance, not on stereotypes or assumptions related to their group membership. She set the paper down and looked directly at Mitchell. When you approached me yesterday, were you evaluating me based on my individual merit and performance, or were you making assumptions based on my gender? Based on my gender, Mitchell admitted quietly. And, when you suggested we might work out some other arrangement, what message do you think that sent about how you view female Marines? Mitchell was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. That I don't see them as real Marines. That I see them as women first and Marines second. Rodriguez felt a small sense of relief. Maybe this kid could learn after all. That's exactly right, Corporal. And that attitude isn't just inappropriate, it's dangerous. When Marines don't trust and respect each other as equals, it breaks down unit cohesion. It creates an environment where some Marines feel like they have to prove themselves over and over again, while others get the benefit of the doubt. I never thought about it like that, Mitchell said. I'm sure you didn't. But that doesn't change the impact of your actions. Let me tell you a story, Corporal. When I first deployed to Afghanistan, I was a sergeant leading a squad of 12 Marines. 11 of them were men, and several of them had attitudes similar to yours. They didn't think a woman could lead them effectively in combat. Mitchell looked up, his attention completely focused now. 3 weeks into the deployment, we were on patrol in Helmand province when we got hit by an IED. 2 of my Marines were wounded, and we were taking small arms fire from multiple directions. While some of my Marines were returning fire, I had to make split-second decisions about medical evacuation, calling for air support, and coordinating with other units in the area. Rodriguez paused, her eyes focused somewhere beyond the small office, remembering that day with crystal clarity. When the shooting stopped and the helicopters had taken our wounded Marines to safety, one of those Marines who had doubted me came up to me. He said, "Sergeant Rodriguez, I want you to know that you saved my life today, and I was an idiot for thinking your gender mattered." That Marine went on to serve under my command for the rest of the deployment, and he never again made the mistake of judging a Marine by anything other than their ability to do the job. Mitchell sat in silence, processing the story. The point, Corporal, is that when you reduce a Marine to gender stereotypes, you're not just insulting that individual. You're undermining the entire Corps. You're suggesting that some Marines are worth less than others based on characteristics that have nothing to do with their ability to serve. I understand, Staff Sergeant. I really do. And I'm sorry. Not just for getting in trouble, but for disrespecting you and everything you've accomplished. Rodriguez studied his face, looking for signs that this was genuine remorse rather than just an attempt to avoid punishment. What she saw convinced her that the young Marine was finally beginning to understand the gravity of his mistake. I appreciate that, Corporal. But an apology isn't enough. The question now is what we do going forward. Mitchell's stomach dropped. He had been hoping that a sincere apology might be enough to make this go away, but clearly Rodriguez had other plans. I have several options here, she continued. I could file a formal equal opportunity complaint, which would trigger an official investigation. Depending on the findings, you could face anything from counseling to administrative separation from the Corps. I could also handle this at the unit level with disciplinary action under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Mitchell felt the color drain from his face. Either of those options could effectively end his military career before it had really begun. However, Rodriguez continued, I believe in giving Marines a chance to learn from their mistakes and prove that they can do better. So I'm going to offer you a third option. What's that, Staff Sergeant? For the next 30 days, you're going to report to me every morning at 0630 for additional training on equal opportunity policies, military ethics, and professional relationships. You're also going to write a research paper on the history of women in the Marine Corps, including the challenges they've faced and the contributions they've made. Finally, you're going to attend every equal opportunity training session offered on base for the next 6 months, even if it's not required for your unit.
Mitchell felt a surge of relief mixed with determination. This was a chance to make things right, and he wasn't going to waste it.
Yes, Staff Sergeant.
I'll do whatever it takes.
I'm not finished yet, Rodriguez said. If at any point during the next 30 days you fail to meet these requirements, or if you engage in any similar behavior, I will immediately file formal charges.
Is that understood?
Perfectly understood, Staff Sergeant. Rodriguez leaned forward slightly. Corporal, I want you to understand that I'm not doing this because I'm soft or because I don't take harassment seriously. I'm doing this because I believe the Marine Corps is better served by Marines who learn from their mistakes than by Marines who get kicked out for making them.
But this is your only chance. There won't be a second one.
I won't let you down, Staff Sergeant.
Don't do it for me, Corporal. Do it because it's the right thing to do.
Do it because every Marine deserves to serve in an environment where they're judged by their character and performance, not by stereotypes and assumptions. Rodriguez stood up, signaling that the formal part of their conversation was coming to an end. But, as Mitchell started to rise, she held up a hand. One more thing, Corporal.
I want you to think about something.
Yesterday in the mess hall, there were junior Marines watching our interaction. Some of them were female Marines who were just starting their careers.
What do you think they learned from watching a senior NCO get propositioned for domestic services? Mitchell winced.
He hadn't thought about the broader impact of his actions, but now he could see how his behavior might have affected other Marines beyond just Rodriguez.
They learned that even senior female Marines aren't safe from that kind of treatment, he said quietly. Exactly. And what do you think the male Marines learned?
That it's okay to treat female Marines differently. That they're not real Marines.
Right again.
So when you're doing your research and attending your training sessions, I want you to keep that in mind.
This isn't just about you and me.
It's about the kind of Marine Corps we want to have, and the kind of example we want to set for the Marines who will come after us. Mitchell stood up, his bearing more confident now that he had a path forward. Staff Sergeant, I know I messed up badly, but I want you to know that I'm going to learn from this.
I'm going to be better. Rodriguez nodded.
I hope so, Corporal. Because if you can turn this around, you'll be a stronger Marine and a better leader for having gone through it. But if you can't, you'll be finding a new career very quickly.
As Mitchell prepared to leave, Rodriguez had one final thought.
Corporal, there's something else I want you to consider. Yesterday, you assumed that because I'm a woman, I would be good at domestic tasks. But you never asked if I actually enjoy those tasks or if I'm any good at them. Mitchell paused, curious where this was going. For the record, I hate doing laundry, I'm a terrible cook, and my living quarters pass inspection because I learned military standards, not because of any innate feminine ability. The assumptions you made about me weren't just inappropriate, they were also completely wrong. Despite the seriousness of the situation, Mitchell found himself almost smiling. There was something about Rodriguez's matter-of-fact delivery that made the point more effectively than any lecture could have. Now get out of my office and start proving that you deserve to wear that uniform, Rodriguez said. Yes, Staff Sergeant.
Thank you for giving me this chance. After Mitchell left, Rodriguez sat alone in her office for several minutes, thinking about the conversation.
She had handled similar situations before, but each one required careful consideration of the individual Marine involved and the specific circumstances. Some Marines responded well to counseling and education, while others never seemed to get the message no matter how many chances they were given.
Only time would tell which category Corporal Jake Mitchell fell into.
But, for now, she had done what she could to address the immediate problem while giving a young Marine the opportunity to learn and grow. Whether he took advantage of that opportunity would be up to him. 3 weeks into his additional training program, Corporal Jake Mitchell was discovering things about the Marine Corps that he had never learned in basic training or military occupation specialty school. Each morning at 06:30, he reported to Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's office with his notebook and pen, ready for another lesson in military history, ethics, or equal opportunity policies. What had started as a punishment was gradually becoming something more like education. On this particular morning, Rodriguez had prepared something different for their session. Instead of discussing policy or reviewing historical events, she had arranged for Mitchell to meet with several other Marines who could share their perspectives on military service and leadership. "Corporal, today I want you to hear some stories from Marines who have had different experiences than your own," Rodriguez said as Mitchell took his usual seat.
"The first person I want you to meet is Gunnery Sergeant Patricia Williams." A few minutes later, a tall African-American woman in her early 40s entered the office.
Her uniform was immaculate, and her bearing suggested the kind of confidence that came from years of successful leadership. The ribbons on her chest told a story of multiple deployments, commendations, and specialized training. "Gunny Williams, thank you for taking time to speak with Corporal Mitchell," Rodriguez said. "Gunny Williams is our unit's logistics chief, and she's been in the Corps for 22 years. Williams settled into the extra chair that Rodriguez had brought in for the meeting. "Pleasure to meet you, Corporal. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez tells me you're working through some issues related to professional relationships and equal treatment."
Mitchell nodded, feeling somewhat nervous.
He had seen Gunnery Sergeant Williams around base, but had never spoken with her directly.
Her reputation as a no-nonsense leader preceded her. "Corporal, let me start by asking you a question," Williams said. "When you look at me, what do you see?" It was a loaded question, and Mitchell knew it. He thought carefully before answering.
"I see a senior NCO with a lot of experience and responsibility, Gunnery Sergeant."
"Good answer. But 3 weeks ago, what would you have seen?" Mitchell considered this honestly. "Probably a woman first, and a Marine second." Williams nodded approvingly. "At least you're honest. Now let me tell you what I see when I look at you."
"I see a young Marine who made a mistake but who seems willing to learn from it. The question is whether you're going to let that learning stick, or whether you're going to fall back into old patterns when things get comfortable." Over the next hour, Williams shared stories from her own career. She talked about the challenges she had faced as both a woman and an African American in a predominantly white, male organization. She described incidents where her authority had been questioned, her competence doubted, and her contributions minimized. But she also talked about the Marines who had supported her, the leaders who had given her opportunities to prove herself, and the satisfaction that came from earning respect through performance rather than having it handed to her. "The thing you need to understand, Corporal," Williams said as their conversation wound down, "is that when you make assumptions about someone based on their gender or race or any other characteristic, you're not just insulting them. You're robbing yourself of the chance to learn from them and work with them effectively." After Williams left, Rodriguez brought in Staff Sergeant Carlos Mendoza, a combat veteran who had served as her squad leader during their deployment to Afghanistan. Mendoza was a compact man with intense dark eyes and a collection of ribbons that spoke to his experience in ground combat operations.
"Corporal Mitchell," Mendoza said after Rodriguez had made the introductions, "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez saved my life in Afghanistan.
Not because she was trying to prove anything about women in combat, but because she was a good Marine who made smart decisions under fire." Mitchell listened as Mendoza recounted the same incident that Rodriguez had described during their first counseling session, but from the perspective of one of the Marines who had initially doubted her leadership. "I'll be honest with you," Mendoza said. "When I first heard we were getting a female squad leader, I wasn't happy about it. I had all the same stupid ideas that you probably had. I thought she'd be a liability, that we'd have to protect her instead of focusing on the mission." "What changed your mind?" Mitchell asked. "Reality," Mendoza said simply. "The first time we went on patrol, she knew the terrain better than anyone. She had studied every map, every intelligence report, every piece of information about our area of operations. When we hit that IED, she didn't panic, she didn't freeze up, and she didn't need anyone to rescue her. She took charge and brought us all home." Mendoza leaned forward in his chair. "But here's the thing that really opened my eyes. After that firefight, I realized that my doubts about her had made me a worse Marine. Instead of focusing on my job, I had been watching her, waiting for her to fail, second-guessing her decisions. That kind of thinking doesn't just hurt the person you're doubting, it hurts the whole unit. The conversation with Mendoza was followed by a meeting with Sergeant Jennifer Park, a martial arts instructor who had competed in several inter-service competitions. Park was small and slight, the kind of person who might be overlooked in a crowd, but when she demonstrated some basic self-defense techniques, Mitchell quickly realized that physical size and traditional gender roles had very little to do with actual capability. "Corporal," Park said after throwing Mitchell to the ground with what seemed like very little effort, "the biggest mistake people make is assuming they know what someone else is capable of based on how they look. I've been underestimated my entire career, and I've learned to use that to my advantage." Each conversation was building on the previous one, creating a comprehensive picture of what it meant to serve alongside Marines from different backgrounds and experiences. But Rodriguez wasn't finished yet. The next day, she arranged for Mitchell to spend time with some of the junior Marines in their unit, particularly the female Marines who were just beginning their careers. Private First Class Sarah Johnson was 19 years old, fresh out of Marine combat training, and eager to prove herself in her first permanent duty station. "Corporal Mitchell," Johnson said during their conversation, "can I ask you something honestly?" "Sure, PFC. When you made those comments to Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, did you think about how it might affect Marines like me?" Mitchell considered the question carefully. Over the past 3 weeks, he had been forced to think about the broader implications of his actions, but hearing it directly from a junior Marine gave it a different impact. "I didn't think about it at all," he admitted. "But I should have." Johnson nodded. "Because when I heard about what happened, my first thought was that if a staff sergeant can be treated that way, what's going to happen to me? I'm just a PFC. I don't have 15 years of experience and a combat deployment to prove my worth." The conversation was uncomfortable but necessary. Johnson went on to describe some of the challenges she had already faced in her brief time at Camp Pendleton, from Marines who assumed she was weak to others who treated her differently because of her gender. "The thing is," Johnson said, "I don't want special treatment. I don't want anyone to go easy on me because I'm a woman. But I also don't want to be automatically dismissed or have to work twice as hard just to get the same respect that male Marines get." Mitchell found himself thinking about his sister back home, who was about the same age as Johnson. How would he feel if someone treated her the way he had treated Rodriguez? The thought made him uncomfortable in a way that all the policy discussions and historical lessons hadn't quite managed to achieve. As his 30-day training program neared its end, Mitchell had also been working on his research paper about women in the Marine Corps. What had started as an assignment he viewed as punishment had become a genuinely interesting exploration of military history. He had learned about Marines like Offa Mae Johnson, the first woman to enlist in the Marine Corps Reserve in 1918, and about the Women's Army Corps veterans who had fought for the right to serve in combat roles. But the most impactful part of his research had been learning about contemporary female Marines who were serving in roles he had never imagined. Combat engineers, intelligence analysts, helicopter pilots, infantry officers, the list went on and on. Each story challenged another assumption he had made about what women were capable of or interested in doing. On the final day of his training program, Rodriguez asked Mitchell to present his research to a small group of Marines from their unit. It was both a chance for him to share what he had learned and an opportunity to demonstrate his growth to his peers. Standing in front of the group, Mitchell felt nervous in a way that was different from the anxiety he had experienced during his first counseling session with Rodriguez. This time, he was nervous because he wanted to do well, because he had something important to say. 3 weeks ago, he began, I made assumptions about Staff Sergeant Rodriguez based on her gender. I thought those assumptions were harmless, maybe even natural. I was wrong on both counts. He went on to describe what he had learned about the history of women in the Marine Corps, the challenges they had faced, and the contributions they had made. But, more importantly, he talked about what he had learned about himself. I realized that my assumptions weren't just about gender, he said. They were about value. I had unconsciously decided that some types of work were more valuable than others, and that some Marines were naturally suited for certain roles based on characteristics that had nothing to do with their abilities or interests. The presentation went well, but Mitchell knew that the real test would come in the weeks and months ahead. It was one thing to understand these concepts intellectually, but it was another thing to consistently apply them in daily interactions with other Marines.
After the group had dispersed, Rodriguez asked Mitchell to stay behind for a final conversation.
"Corporal, I want you to know that I'm proud of the work you've put into this program," she said. "You could have just gone through the motions and tried to avoid further trouble, but you genuinely engaged with the material and the conversations."
"Thank you, Staff Sergeant. This whole experience has been eye-opening for me." "I'm glad to hear that. But I want to be clear about something. This training program is ending, but your education isn't. The real challenge starts now, when you have to apply what you've learned without someone looking over your shoulder." Mitchell nodded. "I understand. And I want you to know that I'm committed to being better. Not just because I don't want to get in trouble, but because it's the right thing to do." Rodriguez stood up and extended her hand. "I believe you, Corporal. And I'm going to be watching to see how you put these lessons into practice. The Marine Corps needs leaders who understand that our strength comes from the diversity of our people and the unity of our mission." As Mitchell shook her hand, he felt the weight of both expectation and opportunity. He had been given a second chance, but more than that, he had been given a new perspective on what it meant to be a Marine. 6 months later, Mitchell was leading a team of Marines in a training exercise when he noticed that one of his team members, a female lance corporal, was being dismissed by some of the other Marines when she offered tactical suggestions. Without hesitation, Mitchell intervened. "Hold on," he said to the group. "Lance Corporal Davis has been studying our training scenarios more than anyone else. Let's hear what she has to say." It was a small moment, but one that might have gone differently 6 months earlier. As he listened to Davis outline her tactical recommendations, Mitchell thought about Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and the lesson she had taught him about judging Marines by their performance rather than their appearance. The training exercise was successful, in part due to Davis's suggestions. But, more importantly for Mitchell, it was proof that the lessons he had learned weren't just academic exercises. They were practical tools for being a better Marine and a better leader. That evening, as he wrote his daily journal entry, a habit he had developed during his training program, Mitchell reflected on how much his perspective had changed. He still had more to learn, and he knew there would be times when he would have to consciously fight against old assumptions and ingrained habits. But he was no longer the same Marine who had approached Rodriguez in the mess hall with a request based on gender stereotypes. He was becoming the kind of Marine who understood that strength came in many forms, that leadership required respect for all team members, and that the Corps was stronger when every Marine was valued for their individual contributions rather than dismissed based on superficial characteristics. It had been a hard lesson to learn, but it was one that would serve him well throughout his career. And, perhaps more importantly, it was a lesson he would be able to pass on to other young Marines who might otherwise make the same mistakes he had made. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had been right about one thing: there were consequences for treating fellow Marines with disrespect. But she had also shown him that those consequences didn't have to be the end of the story. They could be the beginning of something better.